President Trump has an unlikely semi-defender these days, former President Jimmy Carter, who's, I think, 94. The former president told the New York Times that, quote, the media have been harder on Trump than any other president, certainly that I've known about. A big driver of that hostility could be an unprecedented divide between the American media and the country they write about. Ken Stern was CEO of NPR, National Public Radio, and a distinguished member of the liberal bubble himself. As a longtime Democrat, he realized he didn't know that many conservative Republicans, so he did what no one ever does, and he spent a year traveling the country to meet people who think differently from him on their own terms. He's got a brand new book out, which is excellent, about that experience called Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. Ken Stern joins us tonight. What does your family say when you said, I want to get out there and meet people who vote differently?
They thought I was crazy.
Yeah.
So, I live on a nice Democratic street in Washington, D.C., and my house is 100% Democrat. My wife and 10-year-old son were not too approving of this notion, and I suspect my neighbors weren't either. But I went out and really saw a world that I didn't know of. And it was a remarkable experience. I learned tons about Republicans, about the country as a whole. And that's really the source of the book. And it was
boy, I mean, we do this segments like this all the time on the show about the divide, and increasingly no one ever talks to anybody they disagree with. What were your first impressions of this new world?
So one of the impulses for the book was the notion that we've actually become much more geographically and culturally divided than ever before. We have, 10 years ago there were about 1,000 landslide counties that one party or another won by 20% or more. This time around there was 2,500, about 60% of the country. We're increasingly dividing ourselves so that one side doesn't know the other. I think going in, I had a typical Democratic attitude, not very flattering towards Republicans, but I sat in churches. You sent me pig hunting in Texas.
That was my recommendation.
It was, and it was a great recommendation.
Did you meet any liberals pig hunting in Texas?
Pig hunting in Texas? Maybe the pigs, but no one else. It was just a remarkable experience. I met people who I would never have met otherwise, who had led remarkable lives, who served their communities, who had, I think, deep thoughts about the way their communities and their government should work. And I learned a ton from them, and that's really the experience.
The funny thing is, when you told me about this book, I think it was a couple of years ago, I thought it was a really cool idea. Now it seems like a completely radical idea that no one would ever do. How do you think, having done this and been in the media for so long, this divide affects the way that we cover news? It seems like most people who work in the press are from one America, but not the other.
Yeah, I think it's a fair criticism. And I think, so I was at NPR for a long time, and I knew, and I still know, that the people there try to tell a balanced story.
Yeah.
But what I never gave credit for until this time is that they live inside a certain bubble. We all do. And it drives what stories they think are important, what sources they look to, how they think about the story, and it's an enormous challenge, I think, for media, because it means that they don't tell the stories of half the country. And I think that's really what's missing from mainstream media.
I think that's right. There's very little cultural diversity. Yeah. So I actually learned something as someone who's spent his life hunting around guns. I didn't know how often guns were used defensively by law-abiding people in this country until I read it from you.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing. For all the issues I plunged into, climate change, poverty programs, and guns, I really learned a lot from experts I would ordinarily talk to.
Yes.
I talked to John Lott about guns and learned an enormous amount from him. And the biggest thing, and I'll get to defensive gun use, is, look, gun homicides in this country have gone down by over half over the last 20 years, as the number of guns in this country have gone up. We spend time talking about gun control, but we don't actually talk about the things that actually drove gun homicides down over the last 20 years. Why don't we talk about that more? The interest of the story, I didn't even know the term defensive gun use before this. And the Department of Justice estimates that it happens 60,000 times a year. There's a Florida State study that says about 1 million times a year.
But a lot.
It happens either way, high end, low end. It happens a lot, and I actually found stories. I told one of them in the New York Post this week about how people use guns to protect themselves. It's just an important part of the gun story that just isn't spoken about very much.
You wrote about a store clerk who repelled a robber with gunfire, walks out, knocks the guy down with a bullet, cigarette in his mouth, and says, "Castle Doctrine, baby."
Yeah, it's like a modern day Clint Eastwood. It was an unbelievable story.
Ken Stern, what a great book, and good for you for doing that. I don't know anybody else who would do that in your world. Thank you.
And thank you, Tucker, for your help with the book.